Welcome. I'm Jeffrey Sachs of Beit Agnon on behalf of our organization and our dear friends at the Jewish Review of Books. We're happy to welcome you all to what I think will not be, I fear, a very happy event. It'll be a serious event. It'll be somber. We're dealing with the tragic issues that are facing the Jewish people here in the land of Israel, where the three of us happen to all be at the moment, and of course, throughout the world where many of you are. And we thank you. We thank you for joining us at this, what I hope will be the first of many group endeavors between the Jewish Review of Books and AGNON House. And let's promise next time we'll be doing something full of lots of good laughs. But for the moment, we're here to talk about the special issue that the Jewish Review of Books released before and after October 7th. I will leave it to my friend Shai to say a few words about that. I'll just mention in the chat, you can see links to the Jewish Review of Books and the article by myself, by Neta Stahl, and indeed an article which I don't think we'll have enough time to speak about, a very fine article by Shai Secunda himself, who is consulting editor at the Jewish Review of Books and a professor of Jewish studies at Bard College. You can see that in the chat. And I will also just, for commercial purposes, mention that this summer, AGNON House is taking a tour in English in the footsteps of Jewish life, literature, and learning in July to Poland. There are few places that it seems appropriate to travel to these days outside of Israel. And the irony should be lost on no one that Poland is one of them. If you'd like to join us as we travel, certainly with a focus on the events that happened in Poland in the 20th century, but also the events that happened in Poland in the 18th and 17th centuries, and we travel with Agnon in hand and walk in his footsteps and read his stories of Poland, and really do try to capture the entirety of that experience on a group. Many of you I see online have been with us in the past, so we have a few spaces left. And if you're interested, please do take a look at the URL agnonhouse.org.il/Poland 2024, or take a look at the link there in the chat. But now I turn the microphone over to our MC for the evening, Professor Shai Secunda.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So it's an honor to be introducing today's conversation, War Writing Remembrance, which will be an online discussion between Neta Stahl and Jeffrey Sachs. As mentioned, my name is Shai Secunda. I'm a contributing editor at the Jewish Review of Books and a professor at Bard College. Our discussion today is a collaboration between AGNON House and the Jewish Review of Books, and I'm grateful to both Jeff Sachs of AGNON House and Abe Socher and other members of the Jewish Review of Books team for making this happen. We're here to continue discussing the sorts of difficult things which we have not been able to avoid for 163 days now, namely war, tragedy, pain, and suffering. But we do so with some comfort and considerable insight provided by writing, both our own in the recent war issue of the Jewish Review of Books, and that of great writers, in this case, Shmuel Yosef Agnon or Shai Agnon. For some Israelis and some readers around the world, Agnon can be mistakenly seen as old-fashioned, traditional, and constricted by the 4 cubits of classical Jewish learning. In fact, Agnon's writing has the remarkable ability to use that learning to confront the current situation, whatever it may be. Ever since I began reading Agnon, I have known this fact, but it's become clear for me through my work at the Jewish Review of Books. In the summer 2023 issue of the JRB, I penned an autobiographical essay about rereading Agnon's Berlin novel Until This Day while spending a year in Berlin. Agnon's contemporariness was further confirmed for me again in the wake of October 7th, when Neta Stahl used Agnon's City and Its Fullness to drive her moving reflections on growing up in Kfar Azza in an essay entitled A Kibbutz and Its Fullness. And Jeff Sachs offered his translation of Agnon's response to an interview about Judaism and war. My role here today is to introduce our discussants, not to discuss myself, and so I'll now turn to that task. Professor Neta Stahl is Associate Professor of Modern Hebrew Literature and the Director of the Stillman Program in Jewish Studies at Johns Hopkins University. She's the author, most recently, of The Divine in Modern Hebrew Literature, and is currently working on a book about the poet Uri Tzvi Greenberg. Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs is Director of Research at the AGNON House in Jerusalem and is the founding director of Fatid and its webyeshiva.org program. He is also the editor of the journal Tradition. So without further ado, I turn the mic over and I look forward to this meaningful conversation.
Thank you, Shai. We should mention that people are welcome to make comments in the chat, and if there's time at the end, Shai will try to moderate some of them and share them. But Neta, thank you for being with us. I should say that you are joining us, even though normally you reside in Baltimore, where you're a professor at Johns Hopkins. But at the moment, you're here with your family here in Israel, and so first of all, welcome. And as readers of the piece know, your family was very, very directly affected by the events of October 7th because your family is from Kfar Azza, a kibbutz right there in what we call the Otef, the envelope surrounding Gaza, and that is in fact where you grew up. So I very often say in discussing Agnon, Agnon, if somebody were to read the collected works of Agnon, you would think he had spent his whole life in this little Galician town, Buchach, which today is in Western Ukraine, but when he lived there was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then later after he leaves, it's part of Poland and is completely destroyed in the Shoah, as described in the story that you talk about in your piece. Uh, but it's proof, he lives Buchach, he's about 20 years old, but it's proof I always say you can take the buchach out of the boy, but you can take the boy out of buchach, but you can't take the buchach out of the boy, which is of course true for so many great authors where place is central in their writing. Who would imagine that James Joyce writes Ulysses not sitting in Dublin, but after he had long left it. And Mark Twain writes Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer long after he has departed from the banks of the Mississippi, and so on and so forth. So that's true for Agnon. But about you, I would say, for those of us that have family on kibbutzim or have a sense of what the kibbutz means in the life of Israeli life and culture and society, you can take the girl out of the meshek, but you can't take the meshek out of the professor. Once a bat Kfar Azza, always a bat Kfar Azza. So to come down to it, your piece looks at this story in which Agnon, many years already in Jerusalem, hears the tragic news of the utter destruction of his hometown and all of its inhabitants and the world that he had spent so much of his career until then and would dedicate the next 20 some odd years after trying to get at and record and eternalize, not in history but in imaginative fiction, and what it means to be at a remove from that place when the news comes. So October 7th, you're in Baltimore and you have this experience, and your mind immediately goes to the parallel experience that Agnon undergoes. So tell us about that. Tell us about, just lead us through what was going on, on October 7th as you're hearing the news, and how your mind tries to process this, as you know, of course, very well, that your loved ones are right there on the front line.
Yeah, thank you, Shai, and thank you, Jeff, for your wonderful introduction and for having this conversation. I think you touched such an important aspect of really even the discussion today, that I'm actually not in Baltimore, but actually in Israel, but not where I always in when I'm in Israel, because when I come to Israel, I always, first thing when I land, and mostly that's where I stay, it's Kfar Azza. My parents live there, my siblings, two of my siblings and their children. So And obviously, as you say, I never actually left in that sense. And I know that that's the same. It's not just me, it's everyone from Kfar Azza and a lot of people from Kibbutzim, as of, from other places. But to talk about my experience then, even now coming to Israel, to home, but not home really, because I can't really, actually tomorrow I'm going with my father and my daughter that joined me to Kfar Azza for the first time. And actually I should say it's the first visit for me in Israel since October 7th. So it's this conversation happens in a moment that the emotions are very high. I just met um, I arrived on Thursday night, so on Friday morning I met many of the people that were there and are now in staying in a hotel in Kibbutz Shpaim, where my father stays. I met today with people. I met today with the father of one of the hostages. So the contemporaneous of that thought of Agnon, actually for me, it's more like Agnon in, I guess, for the night than Agnon from Siman. That when he comes back, it's really before World War II, but it's that kind of like between the two world wars. When for him, World War I was the great war, which actually brought the destruction. He doesn't know yet that there would be another or a final destruction, if we can say that. So for me, it's to come to the destruction in a sense as a foreigner coming home, not home, and not just and not really a foreigner, but really as a guest.
A guest for the night.
A guest for the night. I'm staying for 2 weeks.
Right.
I also have to say that maybe just before I answer your question, when the piece was published in Jewish Review of Books, I got an appeal from a few of my old friends from the kibbutz, especially touching was an appeal from the family of my good friend that I mentioned that was murdered with his family that I mentioned in the piece. If they said a lot of people asked them if I can translate it into Hebrew because they find it hard, kind of like distance of the language is kind of like an obstacle for them. So overnight, I translated it into Hebrew, and people responded in a sense as if, I once again, and I don't compare myself to Agnon, of course, but I feel that in a sense, I continued something that Agnon was trying to do, to write about his experience to the people that experience something of the same thing or go through that, I would say mourning really, but I feel is what we all do now. And the remembering is part of it, but it's mourning while remembering, or remembering and mourning. So when it reached people that I was very touched by the way people reacted to it, people that actually were there and were the victims, really.
We thank you. The Hebrew version of the article you shared with us, it's available online on the AGNON House website, and I've just posted a link to it in the chat for those that would like the Hebrew version as well. But it's in the piece you use Agnon. I guess we should maybe introduce something about this, this epic story of Agnon's, which I think fairly well known for those that know Agnon stories. But even we admit that not everybody knows all of Agnon's stories. Agnon has a story called Hasiman. We don't have time to go into the background of its composition. It began as a very short story and it kind of grew over time. But it's a very, very clearly, even more so than the autobiographical voice that we know from most of his narration. It really is, while not complete autobiography, because the center of it is a quite fantastical, mystical encounter. But it is the description of being in Jerusalem in June 1943 and receiving the news that Buchach has become Judenrein, that there had been a ghetto. The Jews were rounded up. They were taken to the Fedor Hill overlooking the town, killed in two actions and buried in mass graves. And this news arrives in Jerusalem, and Agnon, for whom the whole world, is Buchach, and for whom Buchach becomes a symbol of the whole world, because he can't tell the story of the entirety of the Holocaust, and this is true for so much of Holocaust literature, and of course Agnon's story can't be spoken of as Holocaust literature in the same sentence as writers like Appelfeld or Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi, et cetera, because it's a Holocaust story which is taking place in Jerusalem. And he knows at the time that he's telling it that his immediate family was no longer even there. His immediate family, his parents had already passed away. His siblings had left either to come here to Israel or to the United States. But he's in mourning for the city itself. And he's walking around Jerusalem with this knowledge on Erev Chag HaShavuot, with this knowledge that Buchach is destroyed. And he says, the neighborhood was quietly at rest. No one stopped me on the street, and no one asked me for news of the world. Even if they had asked me, I wouldn't have told them what had happened to my city. The days have come when every man keeps his sorrows to himself. What would it help if I told someone else what happened to my city? His city surely had also suffered that same fate. That was a sentiment that resonated with me in those, you know, the metaphor of the fog of war is so apt. The fog of after October 7th, in those first early weeks, everyone is going through it. Everyone is suffering. Some have more direct connections to Kfar Azza and Be'eri, and others more distant. But every Jew with a heart in his chest here in the land of Israel, in Europe, in North, wherever you are, must have been experiencing that sense of my own connection to it.
Right.
So Agnon in Hasiman tries to he goes through this process of trying to focus on the work at hand of celebrating the holiday. And of course, we're mindful that October 7th was a holiday. It was Simchat Torah. And most of us here had the experience of getting up and going to synagogue and hearing the first siren and not being, entirely sure of what was going on and whether you're a person who listens to the radio and the television on Shabbat and Chag or not. Nobody knew what was happening in real time. At one point, my son, who's a paramedic and works for Magen David Adom, made contact with us, and he told me we're at war. This was early in the morning. This was probably around 10 in the morning or so. He said, we're at war. And he gave me a number. He said, there are 200 people have been killed. And I said, no, get 200 people. I was sure that it must have been an exaggeration. How could it be? And of course, it was an exaggeration by lowballing it 6 times the actual figure. Right? Imagine if he would have known then in real time the number 1,200. So Agnon goes through this same process of trying to keep reality at bay. So describe for us, your mind immediately goes there. You describe in the piece, your mind immediately goes to Agnon. Describe for us what you see in Agnon, how he tries to experience the holiday, and and
Mhm.
and nevertheless the intrusions of reality on memory, and then how it played out for you.
So I have to say, like I say in the piece, for me, it was not even the kind of news in the sense that I I just I saw that there is something going on early on because my cell phone was there was this note about there is some call for people to get into their home shelters in the Otef. And I immediately, what I done immediately is to ask if I see that, and I do that, over the years so many times. So it started at just another time that they all are in their shelters. but soon enough, I realized that this is not another regular time. So my moment of understanding this is more than but like you say about the 200, it only downed, the scale like much, much later. And in that process of actually even thinking, I think what was so hard is to even say even the word, the name Kfar Azza in the like in of course I never went to bed at night, and I was mostly got the news from my siblings and my father when they could actually write anything, because most of the time we were just they couldn't even, they tried to not show any sign that there is anyone in their houses in there, so they didn't use their cell phone. But I got a lot of information from friends who, like me, already left Kfar Aza years ago, but we all kind of like got in touch together just to gather more and more information and try to understand.
Mhm.
And that
That's
sense
so interesting,
of,
because that's in our interconnected small village digital world,
right,
that's analog to what happened in Jewish communities around the world, in North America, here in what was then Palestine in the 40s, these Landsmannschaften, right? In
right,
other words, all the people from Buchach that lived in Jerusalem or that lived
right,
in Eretz Yisrael, they knew each other, and they would share the bits of news and the scraps of news. They didn't have WhatsApp and Twitter in order to do it, but it was the same kind of impulse that Jewish people from around the world have to gather together with the people from the
right.
Altaheim, from the old home, to connect through that.
Exactly. And it's interesting because my all of my friends were in shul the next day, right? And we were talking about how they know or don't know what happened. But then, after davening, they came to my house because they know that I have family in Kfar Aza. So the kind of like the way you, but here is where I found myself needing Agnon, and especially a Siman. Um, I felt that I cannot even think of Faraza, uh, the people, even the words, as I said, because it's too painful. If I think about them, I think about what's going on, and I know already by this time that specific people that I know already are not with us, but also that there is so much that I don't know. Um, but that feeling that Agnon, I think, communicate in such an, I would say, effective way is, here I am trying to remember, but not remember because it's a holiday,
Mhm.
but because, and I need to, bless, like say, make a kiddush and not have my tears contaminated. Like it's kind of proud by the fact that it didn't
Is it his tears
contaminate
don't his tears don't drip into the Kiddush cup? Yeah.
into the cup. And he think about, he keeps mentioning the things that he used to do, uh, and his parents used to do back in Buchach on Shavuot, as if to keep the holiday there, but also to keep the memory of what the parents did.
And so maybe this is a perfect place. I'd like to ask you to read a passage from your essay. Now, you do make one completely outrageous claim in the essay, which I feel compelled to call you out on. You say that you do not think of yourself as a writer. Now, anyone
That's
who could
as
have
much as I was.
anyone who now I understand you're a professor, you're a scholar, part of scholarship is writing, but anyone who could have composed this essay, which has had such a global impact, has touched people as deeply as this has, can no longer make the claim that she is not a writer. But okay, but that aside.
I should say something about it. What I will say just in a few words is that I, I, I wrote a little bit before October 7th, but I feel that what drove me to write, and indeed maybe I didn't think about myself back then, but now I write more than I've ever done in the sense of writing, not, on my research, like not a research, not a scholarly work, but we all, my friends and relatives, we all say that October 7th brought out of us things that we've never thought we have inside of us. So I consider that part of it, that I don't think I could do that before October 7th.
In other contexts, I've written about in what AGNON says at the Nobel Prize speech in 1966, mitoch catastrophe, he storied because of the historical catastrophe that Jerusalem was destroyed. I was born in one of the cities, but I always imagined I was in Jerusalem, and he imagines himself singing the song. So I've written there, we don't have time to discuss it here, but that for AGNON, writing and creativity is the most authentic Jewish response to catastrophe. So you are quite Agnonian in this regard. But I'd like you to read the passage that we selected, and then we can talk about it. It's a passage in which your writing and your voice is intermingling with your meditation in Agnon's own voice.
Yeah. So Agnon asks, is it possible?
No, go back one paragraph.
Yeah. One paragraph. So Agnon returns to the synagogue. This one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Agnon returns to the synagogue late in the evening, but he cannot stop thinking about his place and his people. Here, and indeed throughout the story, I cannot help but feeling that Agnon has left me a kind of sign, a suggestion for how to think and share the memory of a place and its people while still mourning their loss. Is it possible, the narrator asks himself, that a city full of Torah and life is suddenly uprooted from the world, and all its people, old and young, men, women, and children, are killed, that now the city is silent, with not a soul of Israel left in it? How does one remember this? I ask, actually, not Agnon. How does one remember the city before its destruction? How does one keep those memories pure? I closed my eyes, this is Agnon again, so that I would not see the death of my brothers, the people of my town. It pains me to see my town and its slain, how they are tortured in the hands of their tormentors, the cruel and harsh death they suffer. And I close my eyes for yet another reason. When I close my eyes, I become, as it were, master of the world, and I see only that which I desire to see. So I closed my eyes and asked my city to rise before me, with all its inhabitants and with all its houses of prayer. I cannot close my eyes and become a master of the world. I cannot share the bravado of Agnon's authorial genius. In fact, I don't even consider myself an author. But as Ibn Gabirol guided Agnon, I allow Agnon to guide me. So I sit at my desk, close my eyes, and see Kfar Azza as it rises before me.
The reference to Ibn Gabirol here is on the night of Shavuot, staying up all night in the synagogue, in this little ramshackle synagogue in Talpiot in the 1940s. The vision of, or the person, or it's hard to say what it is. It's not described as a dream. It's described as an actual mystical experience in which the person of Shlomo ibn Gabirol, the great medieval Sephardic Paitan, Jewish religious poet, comes to Agnon, meaning for a great Jewish literary artist to visit, to come from the next world and to visit a Jewish literary artist is a very symbolic thing. And Agnon knows that Ibn Gabirol is the great poet of the Jewish experience. He recalls, he's a youth, and he recalls reading the Piyutim, Shavia Aniyah, which of course has so much resonance now for us. It's a piyut, it's a religious poem about a Jewish girl held captive. Right? You can't think about this now with the resonances and not think that this is something mystical, that we return to this story about a little captive Jewish girl who's been taken off Le'eretz Nochri'ah. right? To a place of oppression. I mean, it's just the past is prologue. It just keeps returning on us in the most bizarre manner. So he remembers how Shlomo ibn Gabirol is able to give voice to Jewish suffering. And
Exactly.
he, Agnon, feels unequal to the task, right? As you do, you say, I'm not really an author. And Agnon says, how it's all on my shoulders now. I
Right.
have to bear witness in my writing for this whole world which has been destroyed. I don't know how I'm going to do it. And along comes Shlomo ibn Gabirol and says, I will show you. And he composes a piyut, an acrostic Hebrew poem. I mean, here's just Agnon couldn't help himself. The idea that this medieval Spanish Jewish Paitan is composing a an acronym for Buchach, Bet
Right.
Vav, and it's spelled not even according to the Hebrew spelling, but according to the Yiddish spelling,
Right.
right? Because surely Shlomo ibn Gambira also knew a little Yiddish, but and then
Right.
you read the story for the first time, and you assume, how is the story going to end? It will end with this piyut, this acrostic poem, which will memorialize the town. But,
But note that Agnon forgets then the pute.
but it
It,
doesn't matter.
it
Why?
doesn't matter.
Be-
Right. Because there is actually I wrote something about that I actually don't think the pute sort of appears there because the next paragraph is so poetic that you can read it as a piyut. So there is actually a
there is
piyut that
a
Agnon
poetic,
revealed.
a residue of
סמרה
the
שערת,
poetry.
סמרה שערת בשרי, and really beautiful. I don't have the translation in hand, so I won't quote the entire passage, but but and there are two things here that I want to actually stress. First, the fact that it's the name Buchach, that as I mentioned, for me, even to think of the word Kfar Azza was so painful. And he kind of like shows us here, the piyut can bring you a way to think even about the most painful element of that symbolizes for you the loss or the pain in a way that you will be able to actually think of and remember. And I think the other thing is that I want to add to what you say about how about the mission of bearing witness. I think especially the earlier parts of the story is also here is a way to go through this. You people like me that went through this horrific experience of not even being able to capture the magnitude of the loss. And you cannot think of the people because you know how they die and how they suffer. So you don't have the emotional, you think to yourself, you can't do that. And of course, you think to yourself, how can I celebrate the holiday? Will I do that next year? When this is not even, you can't even picture yourself going through the next day. It gives us almost kind of like a guideline. Here is how you can think of the place and its memory, the people. What I tried to do here is really, I just closed my eyes. And he says, close your eyes and think about it,
Right.
imagine it, and kind of transfer yourself in time and in place from before to the before. And then you will remember. And you're right, I also felt, I basically Abe asked me, write about your experience, your memory, sorry, from Kfar Aza. And at first I thought, I can't, it's so personal. It's painful, but also so just the people of the kibbutz
Yeah,
memory.
yeah,
It
yeah.
won't say anything to anyone. And then I
But it
felt,
does, it does precisely in the same way that Agnon's dredging up of his childhood memories does and works in his story, it works in your piece.
Yeah.
You're a child, you're in the Beit Yeladim, the children grew up together in their own nursery or in their own living quarters, and you go out and you harvest the first harvest of carrots and you bring it to the kibbutz kitchen, and then memory invades because you're aware of what happens to the family members of that old cook in the kibbutz kitchen, precisely in the same way that it happens to Agnon.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Agnon upbringing was so different than mine. I come from a kibbutz, a secular kibbutz. I live now with people that are observant, and my family. My husband is an Orthodox Jew, so I'm much closer to that world than I used to be back then. But going back there and kind of like thinking, this is the same way that Agnon remembers how one of the memories, the first memories that he shares with, he tells his family, his children and his wife that sit with him around the table, of the Chag. He tells about the nights of Shavuot and how the children used to go to shul, to the synagogue, and like what the children did. So this is not the memory that I could share from back then. But Shavuot in Kfar Azza, or Simchat Torah in Kfar Azza, was celebrated with that kite festival. So in a way, and that's kind of like a tradition. Every year we've done it all these years. And my friend that I used to actually make kites with him when we were kids, he became later the kind of like the father of that kind of like renewing this tradition and so that kind of like a feeling that there is this connection, that it's a collective connection, and it doesn't really matter if Agnon talks about Buchach in Europe in like in a very different kind of Judaism than the Judaism that I'm talking about.
Well, I'll point out the irony that you now live in Baltimore. Some of the neighborhoods of Baltimore might be more reminiscent of Buchach of old than
Of
Kfar
course.
Azza of your youth.
Yeah, it's the shtetl. This is exactly,
I,
I live in Pikesville, so
I want to ask another question, but I'll just remind people that if you'd like to make comments or ask questions, you're free to do so in the chat. I see a few have come in, but I want to ask you to switch hats for a second. In
yes.
in your day job, after all, you're a distinguished scholar of modern Hebrew literature, and we're talking about how literature responds to to trauma, to history as it's processing. And of course, so much of the study of modern of 20th century Hebrew literature or literature since the establishment of the state cycles around, our periodic wars. How did that first generation of Tzabra writers write about the War of Independence, and then later the Six-Day War, and then later the Yom Kippur War, and etc. So of course, none of us are prophets, and most of us don't even make much profit at what we do. But if I could ask you to think about, how do you see Hebrew literature and Jewish culture coming to terms with the events we've been experiencing this year going forward? Do you have any kind of sense
You
of
know,
how that's going to be?
it's such a great question that I feel that we still all of us ask ourselves, right? Um, I already had this kind of like thinking, how do I teach Hebrew literature? Because the next, you know, actually the previous semester, my course that I was teaching, it was kind of ironic because I was teaching a course on representation of war. In general, it wasn't a a Jewish studies course, representation of war in literature. So that kind of like was very hard to get back to teaching. And I had to explain to my students that the rest of the semester is going to be very hard for me to teach because of the distance that we have between the materials that we teach and, um, the transition into, I think actually, um, the field itself would have to reread a lot of what we've written or rewrite what we've written about some of the pieces that we talked about. especially because of this, for example, the way reading the sign was so different this time around. But if I can actually change the hearts in that respect and ask you, because you also write in your piece about Agnon actually revealing, I think something of his that I would, maybe I'll ask you to explain. It changes all of a sudden, or it does in that interview something that he, as you mentioned, that he doesn't do. We are not used to him doing, not before and not after, and he become more straightforward about some kind of like contemporary political elements.
Right, right.
So it's I wonder why do you think at that point in time
Yeah,
what is
it's an
Agnon?
interesting question. Agnon, like so many, authors and artists and musicians and, everybody who thinks, because they sold a record, they should tell us how to vote. Agnon was a very reticent, he was, the most famous and noteworthy man of letters in the state, throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Certainly after the death of Bialik in the 30s, he's the most important man of letters. But unlike Bialik and unlike so many others, he didn't really take a great involvement in the public sphere. He didn't speak out on politics. Most people, wouldn't have known how he voted. He didn't speak out publicly or at hafkanot, at demonstrations and things like that. He really, because he had this, very envious situation with Mr. Shokin, he was not only able to devote himself fully to writing, he had to devote himself fully to his craft, and by personality he wasn't the kind that was going to get involved with everything else. In a talk I gave last year, I compared, using Isaiah Berlin's well-known adage, I compared Bialik and Agnon to the fox and the hedgehog. Bialik was involved in everything in the whole world. Agnon was involved only in writing. Um,
Right.
and you would ask him a question, and he would be very dodgy. He would say, "Well, I wrote a story about that." You'd have to figure out which story and what did he mean, and you have to interpret it. But no doubt, later in life, and the interview that we're talking about was in 1964.
Right.
From time to time, as he got a little older, he loosened his tongue. And Geula Cohen was a journalist from Ma'ariv, and later she was a Chavaret Knesset. She was a member of Parliament and involved in politics, and she was quite right wing herself. But she had this feature in the weekly newspaper in Ma'ariv on Fridays in the magazine section, where she would assemble a kind of symposium of public figures and pose a set of questions and then bring their responses. And Agnon participated in this in a number of occasions. So first of all, it's important to note that the text we're talking about is not a literary text, and it's not even technically a text that he wrote. It's the
Right.
transcript of an interview that he gives. And although his voice is very distinct, you recognize it as Agnon's voice, it's lacking that kind of writerly precision that we know. And Geula Cohen records that she would write up the answers and then Agnon would review. So we know that we can take for granted that it's accurate. And on this occasion, it happened to have been Erev Simchat Torah 1964. So the coincidence of the dates is also noteworthy. It was exactly 59 years before the events that land us in our own situation. And it's not clear why, but she's asking him and the other people on the panel, which included the then newly appointed chief of staff of the army, the young Yitzhak Rabin, and a few others, ask them about, what does it mean to have a Jewish army? What does it mean to have an army that's informed by Jewish values? And this touches Agnon, even though he says he's not much for the cult of power, which was kind of growing and to a certain degree, is ever present and frankly has to be. We live in a country where I have a son who's now on Miluim up north, and my daughter is engaged, and her soon-to-be husband had been on Miluim, for the duration until just a few weeks ago. And all of us, nobody has, everybody has somebody that's connected to this. So there has to be this kind of pride in the army. Otherwise, what would motivate us to keep going? But Agnon is digging a little deeper. He says and here you do see that despite his ardent Zionism, he's a man who grew up in the shtetl, and he fears a little bit the saber rattling, the sword rattling, as if not having raised a sword for 2,000 years, we should now suddenly pick it up with a little bit extra vigor. What would that do to the Israeli ethos, and
Right.
what would that do to Jewish values? But he then says, and I mean, maybe I'll just read this short passage at the end, from which I think we took the I thank our very talented, you and I are both in the debt of the talented editors at the Jewish
Yes.
Review of Books. Um, he says, I don't like militarism. I wouldn't talk about a Gentile army that way, because no Jew in the diaspora would say such a thing about the Gentile authorities. I mean, maybe under his breath. I'm not moved by the technicalities, by the drama of the army. Then he mentions that the special effects and the torches and the parades and the militarism and the military parades. To him, I think what he's saying is it seems like a little bit goyish to see
Right.
soldiers marching down the street. Because I want to tell you, I know that everyone gets excited at the army parade on Independence Day. I know women get particularly excited at seeing the soldiers in their uniforms, but it doesn't make an impression on me. I have no sense for things that can be done with such techniques. However, when I witnessed here in my own neighborhood in Talpiot, which was on the border, it was something of a dangerous neighborhood. Because when I witnessed here in Talpiot, the young men during the War of Independence, how they would defend us, and then they would come into our homes. They would come from their posts on Shabbat Eve to hear Kiddush. Then I couldn't hold back my tears. So it's interesting. It's kind of reminiscent of the passage in Hasiman of making Kiddush and the tears. Here
Right.
he's on Shavuot. He hears about the Holocaust. He tries to plug the tears. But here
Right.
he sees Jewish boys, Safra v'Saifa, or Safra the Kiddush v'Saifa, right? In other words, Jewish boys defending the Jewish land and defending the Jewish people, who want to come and hear Kiddush and participate in the Judaism that should be informing part of the world we're trying to create. That his tears flow. So, what am I saying to you? Israel, which had the insight to make the great and valiant warrior King David into the poet of the Psalms, one who sits and passionately studies the Torah, perhaps that is the secret to our army's endurance. So, I think that says it now. He's saying this already. He's already quite an old man. He's waxing somewhat nostalgic. His own son has gone off and returned to the army at this point. So it was just such a very it was just this serendipity that I recalled this particular piece, which is not well known. It's in his collection of nonfiction writings, and I just thought, oh my goodness. And then when I saw that it was, also from Simchat Torah, it just kind of jumped off the jumped off the page. But I think it goes into some of the themes of what you're talking about in your own piece. In 19 your the story that you deal with, Hasiman, the sign, which is available in English translation in two different places, in a collection of short stories called a book that was lost,
Right.
as well as the opening story in the volume that I edited together with our late and lamented friend Alan Mintz, A City and Its Fullness, which are the stories of uMeloah, in which he's trying to memorialize 300 years worth of stories of Buchach. He's making this testament to Buchach, not as a historian, as something more than a historian, as a greater history, the imaginative history, the truer history that can be communicated through imaginative fiction. So in the 50s, when he was struggling and when his output in the late 50s, early 60s, when his output had slowed down, he was busy writing these stories of the old world, which a lot of people in Israel at that time were not so interested in reading. The
No.
tastes had changed. People wanted the Sabra experience. People wanted Agnon goes through this kind of period of he's a little bit fallow, and he's viewed as being an author of the old world.
Right.
So he's busy writing these stories that become uMeloah, which is actually only published in book form after his death. It had the bad luck of being published right before Yom Kippur 1973, when people were really quite distracted by other things. And it took many years until even it took only in the last 15 years has real serious scholarly attention turned back to this work and rediscovered. And part of that was the work of Alan Mintz, which I had the good fortune of being involved with, and other people here in Israel who have turned their attention to it. It's had a renaissance to understand how incredibly important that work is. But in the 50s, in 56, the critic Baruch Kurzweil writes to Agnon and says, "No, what are you doing? What are you working on?" And Agnon responds, "Boneh ani ir, buchach." I'm building a city. I'm building Buchach. He's not rebuilding it. He's building it from scratch, not out of bricks and mortar or whatever those houses in Kfar Azza were made out of. He's building it from letters, right?
Right.
He's building it because like the piyut in Hasiman, which is actually lost, but it's not lost because
Right.
once it's composed and it's kind of stored in the heavenly
The heavenly.
archive,
Right.
so then it has eternity. Then the memory can be preserved in this world because literary creation, because Jewish creativity has been engaged in and been filed
Right.
away in the next. So
Yeah, and I think maybe we should actually note it's actually from Ellen Mintz at Bet Agnon that I heard. I think it's more than 10 years ago. He gave a lecture on uMeloah after the translation
right,
that he published appeared, and he made it was very important for him to actually stress that a siman, the sign, the story itself was not naturally, or
right,
let's say it's not originally clear, it's not clear that it was originally envisioned as part of uMeloah, of City and Its Fullness, and Its Fullness. It's an editorial decision that his daughter
right,
made,
right, right,
but it fits there so
right,
much, so
right.
well.
So Alan, when
Exactly
we,
because
yeah.
that idea of building a ear that explained to us. I mean, so
So
yeah.
when we were putting the volume together, Alan felt very strongly, and it's the only deviation that we made from the Hebrew book. In the Hebrew book, Hasiman comes
And
at the end. And
right.
Alan felt very strongly that it's a consecration story and it should come at the beginning because it's the story, it's the portrait of the artist as the chronicler of his town, how
Right.
he is called to the task by
Exactly.
none less than this visit from Shlomo ibn Gabirol from the
Right.
next world. And that's why he puts it at the beginning. I should just mention, since we're discussing this is all discussed in Alan's book, Ancestral Tales, which was published tragically. It appeared, the week that he passed away rather suddenly and untimely. But this book, Ancestral Tales, reading the Buchach stories of S.Y. Agnon, which was published in 2017 at the same time that Alan passed away, and it's a companion volume to the English A City and Its Fullness that was published as part of the Agnon Library from the Toby Press. So those are
Right.
two book recommendations while we're awaiting the works of Hebrew literature, which will no doubt begin to appear at some point, trying to trying to make sense and trying to help us to guide us through the events that we've gone through. I would ask one last question, Shai. We'd like to involve you here in this as well. Like I said, Neta, your day job is as a professor on an American college campus, as is yours, Shai. And we're all very mindful and sensitive to the fact that these are challenging times for Jewish students, for Jewish studies, for professors of Jewish studies on American college campuses. And since both of you are so very much involved in the topics that we're discussing now, if you have some kind of reflection on that experience since October 7th, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I think it would be interesting for people to hear. Actually, Shai, why don't we turn it
Yeah,
back to you?
I'll let
So,
Shai answer that.
first of all, I wanted to thank both of you for really a remarkable discussion. I mean, I read your pieces very carefully on the back end, and then once again after it came out, and this discussion further enhanced my deep respect for the difficult work, especially you, Neta, of the memory work and the emotional work that such a piece required. I'll just be quick, and maybe I will refer to the piece that I wrote in this issue. Of course, things can be difficult for Jewish students. It can be difficult for many different students right now on American co college campuses. Um, and I teach at a very unusual place, which is quite small, and is has a very sort of close-knit community, both of faculty and of students. But one of the things that I noticed both at Bard, but also even in the center of New York City, is ultimately that one way of diffusing, and maybe it's naive, but I saw it work in action. One way of either diffusing the tension or working beyond it is to put humans in the same place as one another, to put humans in situations where they can see each other's faces. And I invoked Levinas, who helped me kind of think through this problem. I don't know if it always works, but it sometimes does. And I think that's ultimately what we're all in the business of, especially in the humanities, readers of literature, scholars of literature, is to see the face through the text, to see the text through the face, and to find a way to find insight and peace, and understanding in a very violent, tragic world. So that's what I would say, about that. I do I just want to draw our attention to some things that came in on the chat. I don't know if we have much more time for a
Yeah.
question. There was one point um which sort of was touched upon, but I think is worth um noting, the question of the destruction of Buchach, which already took place earlier. Um, and there's something interesting literarily that's happening when he returns to this moment of destruction. In the piece that I wrote in the summer, when I read perhaps a less known novel of Agnon, that novel was written after World War II. But the narrator is firmly located in the time of World War One in Berlin and in other towns, cities in Germany. And what you could see the way Agnon deals with the problem there of confronting an enormous tragedy, an unimaginable tragedy. He sort of does it from the opposite end. He hints a little bit here or there about what will be coming in the Second World War, but he refuses, I think, on literary grounds,
Yeah.
to do more than hint. In Hasiman, in the situation that Neta found herself in, that wasn't possible. There had to be, even Agnon, the most reticent of of writers, who I think would have wanted to avoid it. There are moments when one
Yeah.
can't avoid it, and it requires great courage, and that's what we saw with Agnon and with Neta's work.
Agreed.
So I think we will conclude. Um, I again wanted to thank you both. I wanted also to encourage attendees, listeners, to subscribe to the Jewish Review books, to be involved in the AGNON House, to make a donation. The link is in the chat. And I hope, as you said already, Jeff, I hope that we have occasions to be together at happier times, and that we get through this together, thinking, reading, talking, and writing. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay. If people want to continue to make chats, or if people have specific questions, we're happy to continue for a few more minutes. But the official program has ended, and this is the virtual equivalent of standing in the auditorium, trying to get out of the door, or wondering if there are any rugelach left. But a very nice attendance. So many people from so many different places. I see someone from Spain and people that I know from all across the United States, and of course here in
Wow.
Israel.
It's interesting. It goes back to what Shai, you said at the beginning in the introduction, that like you go back to Agnon when like it's always contemporary. He has that ability to speak to us, from the past as if he's here, and even like predict in a way. I mean, like, I don't think he was a prophet, but he had that ability, that sensitivity, I guess, to historical moment to. I mean, even the fact that that the publication of City and Its Fullness took place on 73, you would think that's exactly the time that Jews in Israel and around the world would need to read that specific book, because, before October 7th, that felt as if, another point of like we are all being in like facing that catastrophe
Right.
that at the end we managed to avoid, luckily. But it's very
Neta someone Alex Chmielnitsky here asks about a word about your upcoming book on Uri Tzvi Greenberg. You could tell
it's a
us about
good
that.
question. It's actually a complicated answer, but I'll answer. I started writing it. I feel that it's hard for me to write about Uri Tzvi Greenberg now.
Maybe just say a word for people who was Uri Tzvi. Not
So,
everybody is
so
so familiar.
Uri Tzvi Greenberg actually was one of the other poets or writers, Jewish writers, that I actually thought right after October 7th, because his monumental response to the Holocaust, Street of the River, a book of poetic response to the Holocaust that really um, there is nothing like that. I think written in Hebrew or in other languages. It's my feeling was that, oh, of course, Uri Tzvi Greenberg is the first poet to go to, but I couldn't. Uri Tzvi Greenberg's is much less reserved than Agnon, and is in a way his anger and he also mourns, but it's a zam, it's an anger, and it's a feeling that you feel as if your emotions are so overwhelmed just by reading it. I felt that way before October 7th. After October 7th, I just felt that it's too much for me. I don't want to get too political, but I also didn't couldn't really identify with the call for revenge that is very prominent in his book. That for me is kind of like not exactly what I feel, and I actually don't want people to feel that way and to respond from a sense of revenge. So yeah, so I'm getting back to it, but it will take some time. Yeah. Thank
Irene
you, Prof.
Lancaster, Dr. Irene Lancaster points out that Ogden was quite talkative in receipt of the Nobel Peace, not the Peace Prize. He was won the Nobel Literature Prize, not the Peace Prize. He was talkative, but not in the way that we were discussing here. The Nobel, the speech that he gives in Stockholm in December '66 was I mean it was almost midrashic. and it was extremely enigmatic. And he spins a whole agada about himself and who he is and what he's doing. And it's a complete reworking of his biography into the imagined biography. So, yes, he was talkative. He would speak. He wasn't shy. But the question of how direct was he being, and how playful or indirect or canny he was is the question. And in 1966, when he's doing that at the Peace Prize, he was certainly all of those things.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Neta, I wanted to say, the question of Agnon being a prophet. I recently had a conversation that we published in the Jewish Review Books with the Hebrew writer Ruby Namdar. And
Mhm.
one line he told me, I don't even remember if I made it in the piece, but he said, with this notion of writers being prophetic, especially about tragedies, sometimes you wonder maybe the writer should stop writing and it won't come true.
Oh, I see. Because the same thing was about Uri Zvi Greenberg, of course, that
Exactly. Yeah.
there are people that still think, and he himself basically sort of like promoted that notion that he predicted the Holocaust in earlier
Yeah.
poems
Yeah.
in Yiddish, is in Malchut von Tselem, like he writes in images that one can associate with what will happen, a few years later. So yeah, maybe they should stop writing that kind of poetry. I agree.
If only that was our problem, that our authors were writing things that
Yes, yes.
reality imitate is art imitating life, is life imitating art, is life stranger than fiction.
This art creating it. Yeah.
I often think these days, going back to we've forgotten it, but the traumas of the year before October 7th, everything related to the judicial reform, and it doesn't matter which side of that issue you stood on. Everybody understands it was a very traumatic experience for the country. And when I think about the American political strife, again, it doesn't matter which side of how you're going to vote next November. Everybody understands that these are not normal times. Sometimes I think if someone were to write these stories as works of fiction, you'd send them into an editor. He'd take out his red pen and say, "It's too much. It's too much on the nose. No one will believe it, but it's
Right,
true.
right.
It's true."
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Shai. Thank you, Neta. Thank you, Abe Socher at the Jewish Review of Books, and to the Jewish Review of Books, which is, of course, become such an important platform, and not just for writers like us, but for informing people and for bringing together a community of people. I think who are interested in these things. There are so few places where Jews of such diverse opinions and tastes and orientations and commitments can gather virtually or together on a page and think about things. And I think the Jewish Review of Books has really played that role these past few years. So we're very, very glad to be associated with it. So for your work, Shai, thank you for that, and we hope to see everyone again soon. Please, if you're interested, visit us for more information about our trip to Poland in July. Give us Beit Agnon a like on Facebook, or join our newsletter to keep updated with other English programming that we'll be doing, which we hope will be coming with greater frequency than we have in the past. And of course, if you are not a subscriber to the Jewish Review of Books, now is your time. Erev
Thank
Tov.
you.